Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, welcome to the third episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. It's great to be with you. My name is Sam Camp, and I'm the Director of Media at Blackaby Ministries International, and I get the privilege to talk with Richard Blackaby about leadership today. It's good to be with you again.
Always good to be with you.
There are some age-old questions regarding leadership. We've already covered your definition of leadership. So one burning question down through the ages, if you will, is, of course, are leaders born or are leaders made? In a couple of minutes here, just tell us what's the answer.
Answer that age-old question once and for all. Put that to bed.
If you'll just put it to rest for us. We've all been dying to know.
Well, one thing I think has been said before is that I'm not aware of any leaders that were not born. So they're
Touche.
They're all born. But whether you're born as a leader already or whether you develop into a leader over time, that's the question. And I would say that I think it's both. And
that sounds like a bit of a cop-out to me, Richard. Why don't you?
Yeah. Oh, you want further explanation? There's certainly something to be said for how you're wired at birth, and there's a lot of issues, and we unpack some of that in our book on spiritual leadership. But for instance, firstborn children. I'm a firstborn child. And I typically act like
really. I had no idea.
I've got four younger siblings, and all four of my siblings are accomplished, well-educated people. But it's fascinating to me how even now in our middle age, when we get together, so often they still will look to me as, well, Richard, what are we going to do? Or how do we solve this? And the thing about being a firstborn is that you get more experience than the younger kids in responsibility. When, if there's three children and the parents are going to run out for an hour to the store, they don't turn to the youngest one and say, okay, you're in charge. Look out for your older two brothers. They always will look to the oldest child and say, hey, here's my number. If you need, call me if anything happens. If the house is on fire, drag your two siblings out the door. But you do more babysitting. The youngest one doesn't babysit because they don't have anybody to look after. It's the older ones, and they're typically the biggest, strongest, best educated of their siblings because, of course, they're farther down the road in their development. So they're used to having people under them that they can kind of boss around. And so it's no wonder that the majority of American presidents have been firstborn children. The majority of astronauts, kind of overachievers, if you will, have been firstborn because they're just wired that way. They've been socialized that way. But also sometimes size makes a difference. And you wouldn't think so, especially in a modern society like ours. But if, for instance, if you're a boy and you were always big for your age, or you were unusually strong, or even if you were just really smart or you were really charismatic, there are just some people that stand out. That, for instance, if you were always pretty fast and strong for your age, and so you were always the hero on your sports team, or you were made the quarterback of the football team because you could throw farther and better than anybody else or run faster. And so everybody cheered for you, and everybody looked to you to kind of save the day when the team was losing. And when the team won, you were kind of the hero. Well, you might have been genetically just wired to be faster or more athletic than others, but that's not something you chose. It's not something you went to school to learn how to necessarily be stronger. It just you were genetically wired that way. You were more athletic. You weren't clumsy. You had great eyesight. Those are all things you're born with, but they can play out and be leveraged without you even realizing it to where people look to you for leadership.
Do you think that's a matter of because maybe they're gifted in certain ways or born with certain abilities or with a certain height or disposition, that necessarily means that maybe they are given more opportunities
Yeah.
earlier on to lead, and
Yeah.
because of that, you know, the chance of them developing into a leader is greater than someone who hasn't been.
Yeah, and some of that is really socialization, because uh, the adults look and see that you're the biggest kid in the room, and so they say, okay, you're here, you do this, you be in charge. But your size is what that you were born with is what's giving you the opportunities, and so there. And interestingly, when they've done studies of top CEOs, even in modern times, I mean, in the last decade, is it surprising to you that the average CEO of large companies, even now, is a male, and typically the males are above average in height? You think, why aren't CEOs average height? Why?
Yeah.
I mean, what? How would being 6'2" make you any better of a CEO than if you're 5'10"? But the fact is that the majority, there's more, that the average height of the top CEO is taller than just the average employee. Now, why would that be? I mean, you'd say surely. I mean, back in the Middle Ages, if you're going to look for the captain, a general of soldiers, and you're all wielding swords and shields and riding horses, well, physical ability and strength might really make a difference. If I'm going to follow someone into battle, I want to follow a big guy who's really strong and can
Right.
swing the sword and kill a lot of people in front of me. But if he's a CEO just running a meeting, it doesn't matter what he can bench press. It doesn't matter if he can shoot an arrow. But so why do we still hire people like that? Well, because I think innately when you look up to someone physically, they are much more imposing than when you're looking down to maybe someone that's quite short. And so if you've been looked down upon physically your whole life because you were maybe unusually short, the odds of you becoming the CEO of a major company are against you. That doesn't mean you can't lead, and that doesn't mean there aren't any short people that are leading, but statistically, you have a better chance of getting to the top office if you physically appear to be above average. That even to this day, genetics do make a difference. So I would say on the one hand, how there may be some natural gifts and some natural experiences that through no merit of your own, you've just had handed to you, just by the genes you were given, or by the fact that you happen to have been born first and not the fourth child in your family. But I would also say that
So what help? What
Yes.
hope is there for us
Yeah.
average height
That's right.
individuals?
Yeah, I gotta say, before everybody is ready to just throw themselves in front of a bus now and say, there's no chance for me, to say on the flip side is that leadership can be learned. You can learn, you can develop abilities. And of course, in our modern society, physical strength, physical stature is not the most important thing in leadership today. It may give you sort of a psychological advantage sometimes, but people that are gifted with humor, who are gifted at problem solving, who are gifted verbally, and they know how to communicate well. There's lots of ways where you can develop skills to motivate other people, to be thoughtful of other people, to just downright to work hard. I know people that just simply work harder than people that are more gifted than them. I have a PhD, but when I entered the PhD program years ago, I was no way near the smartest person in the room. And I went through with a whole cohort of students at the same time. We had to go through a whole series of tests and papers and language studies just to qualify to get in the program. And at every step, people were falling by the wayside. They're failing certain parts of the entrance requirements and dropping out. And It was just kind of like Survivor. By the time you walked across the stage, there was just a small remnant of all the people that had applied when we went in. But I was one of the survivors, and I tell you what, German just about was my undoing. I had to have 2 years of German and a year of French, and I was terrible at languages. You had to take kind of an intelligence test, and let's just say I did not top the charts with that. There were people in that room that lapped me, I think, on the intelligence test. And so I'm looking at these people in awe, saying, "What on earth am I doing here?" But I had tenacity. I worked hard. I put in long hours. I did whatever I had to do to get the job done. And so genetics had not favored me with language ability and incredibly high IQ, but I did know how to work hard. And so I could make up for my deficiencies in other areas. And so I would say that's why we do this podcast, is to say wherever you're at, you can learn and you can improve as a leader. If you're willing to reflect, if you're willing to honestly take a look at how you're doing things, honestly evaluate the fruit, the results of your leadership, and say, I know it could be better, so what do I need to do? There's lots of ways to grow as a leader. Just reading books, just reflecting on, here's some good leadership skills and here's what I'm doing. How do I need to adjust? And so you can do that as well. I think, in fact, the last thing I'd just say on that is that sometimes people who are just naturally born as leaders get kind of lazy because it always comes easy for them. They don't know why they're good at leading because they've just always done it. They've just entered into a room and they just started to their presence just commanded respect. You know, they say that I think it was John Adams who said of George Washington that George Washington, his whole life, he was always asked to lead, but he was like 6'3", 6'4". He was always the tallest man in the room. So every time they're looking for some military commander or some person who's going to be a good president, he towered above everybody in the room. And so you always saw him.
You couldn't not see him.
Yeah, he was always stood out, and he often showed up at meetings dressed in his military uniform. And so, like, who are we going to pick to be in charge of this military operation? Oh, there's George, a head taller than everybody else, wearing his brilliant military uniform. I guess maybe we should have him do that. So, there's some people that it will just kind of come naturally to them to lead. And so for one thing, they're not really good at teaching others to lead because they don't even know why they're good themselves. But then there's other people that just have learned how to lead. They've read, they've studied, they've gotten a leadership coach, they've had a mentor, they've looked in the mirror and said, I can't do that again. I messed that one up. And so over time, they learned to do the things that helps facilitate good leadership. So, yeah, you can both get to know yourself well, know what maybe works for you, maybe how God has just kind of gifted you with some natural abilities, but then supplement that with just becoming a student of leadership as well.
Yeah. So what would you say to those people who aren't naturally gifted? You mentioned reading and studying as one. Is there anything else that you would recommend for people who aren't a foot taller than everyone else in the room? Well,
because leadership is a people business, learn how people function. Learn what motivates people. You might be the smallest person in the room. You might not be an eloquent public speaker. You might not just command presence by your just physical presence, but you might really learn how to encourage people. And you might learn how to be thoughtful of people and to recognize people and to praise people when appropriate. And you may become the kind of, you might really be good with appropriate humor, and where you might be just really a positive person. And so even when others are despairing and giving up, you still have hope and you're still confident, and you become the kind of person that when there's a difficulty that people are trying to solve, they always want you around because you're positive, you're encouraging, you're a problem solver, you're not negative, you're not critical. So there's lots of things you can do to develop that. And also, it just never hurts to unpack experiences that you have. So if you lead a meeting and it seems as if you lost control of the meeting, or people were bored, or you couldn't get anyone to volunteer, don't just go away and say, "Well, I guess just people don't want to volunteer." I see this a lot in churches. I have people that'll say, "Well, I just can't get volunteers in the church today. Everybody's just too busy." And I'll say, "Well, don't just assume that because people aren't volunteering for you. Don't assume it's because everyone's too busy or they're too carnal or they're too lazy. It might be that the way you're asking for volunteers, or the way that you present yourself, or the way you present the possibility, it's not inspiring. Nobody wants to do what you're trying to lead them to do. So go back and say, okay, I presented the opportunity this way. I used these words. I conducted myself this way, and nobody volunteered. So let me analyze what I did or what I didn't do, because the fact is, people are volunteering all the time for things. And so it's not like nobody is willing to volunteer. It's just that no one volunteered for me. So let me reflect on what I did, what I said. And oftentimes it really helps if you can have enough sense of self-esteem and security that you can ask someone in the room, someone that's watching you, to say, "Well, tell me how that came across. I mean, I gave my little spiel and then not one person volunteered. Was there something missing in my spiel?" Because sometimes we'll sound very negative, or we'll say things that just sink our own boat. We'll say things like, "Well, I really need 2 volunteers." And then we'll say something like, "But if no one volunteers, I'm not sure what we're going to do." Or it may be a lot of hard work, but we need somebody to do this. Or the last 2 people who volunteered never did fall through, and now we're stuck. They don't even realize what they're doing, but they're saying things that are scuttling their own effort. And what they really need is someone who's watching them to say, "Well, listen, why did you say that? I mean, you had them. I sense people were willing to volunteer, and then you said this, and it just shut everything down." Or it just sounded so negative, or you ended on a negative note instead of a positive note, or you know what, the last people who volunteered, you never thanked them, you never recognized them, you never rewarded them. And so when you do that for very long, word gets out, hey, it doesn't pay to volunteer for that guy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's lots of ways that you can, if you will analyze your leadership or lack of success, you can actually grow and develop into a better leader. But it takes a certain amount of certainly honesty and some security to say, I don't want to take this personally. Leadership is just a function that God has given me, and so I want to be the best I can at it. And it may be a little painful at times to have to recognize I really have to grow in some areas, but hey, it'll be worth it in the end when I'm a better leader as a result.
Well, I think that's such an encouraging word to anyone in any function of leadership, from just small things to big things, no matter what it is, that just a practical takeaway is make time for self-reflection, self-analysis, and if you want to take that one step further, have someone that you trust give you that feedback.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a great place to have a quick break, and we're going to come back with just a couple more questions before we wrap up this podcast. You may have heard Richard mention a book he wrote with his father Henry called Spiritual Leadership, Moving People onto God's Agenda. And right now, we want to offer an additional 10% off with coupon code PODCAST. So go to blackabystore.org and use code PODCAST at checkout to receive an additional 10% off. Okay, great. Well, welcome back. We just have one final question that we want to discuss here before we wrap up this podcast today. A common question that we get in regards to leadership is, do leaders make history, or does history make leaders?
I love that question because I'm a history major. I have a PhD in history. And when I was doing doctoral work, you really couldn't major in leadership. and I keep identifying my age here through all this because now you can get all kinds of degrees in leadership. But back in the day,
back in what was it, papyrus? Or
yeah,
what was
when you go off to the monastery to study in a cloister somewhere, and so I was always drawn to leadership, or I was always drawn to history because it was about leaders. Now you can always tell, by the way, whenever I talk about history, people either hated it in school or they loved it. It's rare that you find someone a fence sitter about history, and invariably the people who loved it because of their teacher. Anyone who loved history can tell you the teacher who made history come alive to them in school. And if they hate it, they can usually tell you a teacher that bored them to tears, because the bad teachers talked about dates, about boring councils and meetings and documents, and droned on and on about a bunch of stuff that just bores you to tears. But the good teachers made history come alive because they talked about the people, ordinary people that rose to the challenge of their day. And when everybody else was giving up, when everyone else was losing hope, this particular individual rose up and saved the day. And I love that about history, because in every era, whenever there was a problem, a leader would rise up who was used by God to address the problem and to save the people, save the day. And so I began to realize early on that history was all about people who made a difference. And when I used to teach classes at the seminary on history, I would say, you need to live your life in such a way that 400 years from now, people need to know your name for a midterm exam. This midterm exam is not about just a list of dead people from years ago. This is all about people who live their life in such a way that poor students like you now have to remember their name hundreds of years later. So how would you have to live so that people had to know your name? So anyway, history is about people. But the question is, do individuals shape history, or does history shape people? And so some of the classic examples of that are, for instance, Winston Churchill, probably one of the great examples.
Yeah.
Churchill wanted to be a leader his whole life. I mean, he was in government for many years, was always trying to do something great. His ancestor was the Duke of Marlborough, one of my heroes. The Duke of Marlborough, we'll have to talk about him in a podcast sometime, but
if you could see what I'm seeing, it's Richard's face just lighting up as he mentions these.
I could pull off my shelf a 2,300 volume biography on the Duke of Marlborough that still brings tears to my eyes with joy every time I even think about it. But Churchill had this distinguished ancestor that actually the Duke of Marlborough, his last name was Churchill. He was a Churchill, from whence Winston Churchill was in the same family tree. But then after the Duke of Marlborough won so many glorious victories, he was made the Duke of Marlborough. And so Churchill always wanted to be great like his ancestor. In fact, Churchill was physically born in Blenheim Castle, which is the palace that was built for the Duke of Marlborough. And so he grew up coming over to his uncle's house and seeing this massive, massive palace built in tribute to the greatness of his ancestor. And so Churchill always wanted to be great like him. And he tried and tried and tried and was always on the fringe. He was a bit of a extremist, and he would say things to the extreme, and it would turn people off, and people thought he was eccentric and out of touch and old-fashioned, and basically he was in the backwater politically right up until World War II began. And he wasn't in power when Hitler began invading Europe, and Churchill was just kind of a backbencher, a guy that nobody really was listening to. They all thought he was just kind of a quack, a crazy extremist. But all of a sudden they realized they needed someone like him to be able to stand up to a Churchill. All these civilized British gentlemen, nobles, were being blown away by this ruthless Adolf Hitler. What they really needed was a guy like Churchill. And so Churchill by that time is already a senior adult. So he's tried all of his life, all the way up to his senior adult years, and failed to make a name for himself, except a bad name. And then all of a sudden, Hitler and history arrive. And I think most people would say, and quite confidently, had it not been for World War II, we would never really know anything about Churchill. He would just be in a long line of undistinguished descendants of the Duke of Marlborough who never did much with himself. But with World War II, suddenly he becomes one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. That's why things that historians love that bores other people to tears is, for instance, when you rate presidents. And every year, groups of historians rate U.S. presidents. Who is the greatest? And typically, and the numbers change. Some people's numbers go down over time. Some go up over time. But some of the presidents who are always in the top five is Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman. Those guys are always up there at the top. And what's interesting about and then Abraham Lincoln. He oftentimes makes it. He and George Washington typically vie for the number 1, number 2 spot. What's interesting is that all of those guys basically led in warfare. They all led through a crisis in the nation's history. Lincoln, perhaps the greatest crisis of all in the Civil War. Washington, the next greatest crisis, the Revolutionary War, just becoming independent from England. And so it's interesting that perhaps the two greatest presidents led in the two greatest, most challenging times. So one thing you might say is if Abraham Lincoln had been living in a different time, he might never have even been elected president. I mean, he was a good speaker, but he had a lot of things going against him. And George Washington, if it was in time of peace and prosperity, maybe in the Roaring 20s, you might not have wanted a general to be the president. You might have wanted a businessman to be the president instead. But in that day, you were never sure if England or Spain or France was going to invade you, and so you wanted a strong general type person to be your president. And so what I take from that is, if you live in a difficult time, if maybe in your family or your business or your church, maybe God's called you as a pastor to a church with some real struggles right now. And you might say, well, poor unfortunate me. Other people get called to churches where there's no problems and everything goes great, or they get called to a company where they just roll on from one profit to the next, but I've got all these problems to deal with. Well, that may be so, but the flip side is you also may have the opportunity to become a much greater leader because you've got a greater crisis in front of you. History is staring you in the face, and it will either destroy you or it will make you. And history has a way of making people into great leaders. It gives them the opportunity to be great. And so a lot of times people will look at various presidents and they'll say, well, this guy was actually very intelligent and he led well and he had good people skills. He just led at sort of a backwater time in American history where not much was going on and there weren't any great problems to solve. And so they never had the opportunity to really demonstrate greatness because a great president wasn't required at that time. Whereas in other times in history, a great leader was required and needed. And so those people had the opportunity to rise to the occasion. The last thing just to say about that is if you look at, oftentimes people say that Abraham Lincoln was the greatest president in American history. But the president right before him was Buchanan. And Buchanan faced all the same problems that Lincoln faced, but he refused to address them. He refused to solve those problems. And because of that, he kind of pushed everything down line where Lincoln eventually had to deal with them. And so when you see the presidents rated, Buchanan is often rated as the worst president in American history, and Lincoln is often rated as the best president. I mean, just one followed the other. And they lived in the same time, facing the very same problems. But one refused to address the worst problem in his nation's history, and because of that, he's rated as a horrible leader. The other one waded in and dealt with the horrific issues of his day. It ultimately killed him. He got assassinated for it, but history looks back on him to say he perhaps did some of the greatest work for the nation. And so if you're facing a difficult problem right now, before you want to run and flee in the other direction, you need to realize that history may also be giving you an opportunity to rise to greatness as well, and to lead at a level you might not have ever needed to lead if things had been going better. But because things are in a difficult place, you now have an opportunity to see just what kind of leader God can make you to be and what history can call you to be. And that could be really exciting. So if you're going to lead, you don't want to lead at a time when there aren't any great problems to solve. That's what leaders do. They solve problems. And if there's no problems, you don't really even need a leader. But in times of great problems is when you need great leaders. And so if you're facing some great problems, ask God if he doesn't have you there for such a time, and maybe he's preparing to build you up into the kind of leader that can truly become a great leader for your day as well. I doubt that Lincoln, before he became president, had done a lot of study and preparation to lead huge armies and to deal with all kinds of troublesome generals. But he had to learn how to do that when that suddenly became his moment in history. And the last thing I would say with that too is that if God has called you to a leadership role, maybe he's made you a parent. You've got a couple of teenage children now. Or maybe you've been called as a pastor of a church, but there's a lot of problems in that church. Or maybe you've been led to a business, and now you're discovering that there's some real issues with some of the employees. Well, just understand this. If you feel that God led you to those places, then God knew what you'd find when you got there.
Right.
And yet he led you there anyway. And which means that if you think that your challenge is bigger than your leadership can handle, just understand God led you there anyway. Which means the problem may be bigger than your leadership right now, but your leadership can grow until it's bigger than the problem. And if you've got teenage kids that you don't know what to do with, well, God gave you those kids, and he's entrusted them to you, and God can grow you as a parent until you are able to deal with those kids. And if God led you to that church, you may not have known about all the problems that would be waiting for you when you got there, but God knew they were there. And if God led you there, it's because he wants to grow you. And so the history that you find yourself in now in that church or with those kids, God will use that to grow you and make you a greater leader than you've ever been before. And so don't be intimidated. Don't quit. God knows what he's doing. You may not yet be the leader you need to be, but give God time. He has a great way of growing people until they are the size of leader that history needs them to be in that time.
Well, that's an encouraging word, and I think that's a perfect place to end this week's podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.